October 15th, 1944. Vera Caldwell returned to Pittsburgh late in the evening when fog from the confluence of the three rivers had begun to settle over the downtown bridges. She was 25 years old and worked as a materials inspector at the Homestead Steelworks, one of thousands of women who'd taken factory jobs when the men shipped overseas. She'd just spent 2 weeks in Detroit training on new quality control procedures for armor plate production. In her valise were small gifts for Uncle Harlan, the only family she had left after her parents died. They'd been killed in a railway crossing accident when Vera was 18, and Uncle Harlan had been the one who helped her finish business college, who'd supported her when the world seemed to collapse. Now he was 68 years old, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on Penn Avenue in Lawrenceville, in an old building with pressed tin ceilings and oak floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Vera had planned to visit him first thing in the morning. But as she approached her own building on Liberty Avenue, Mrs. Kowalski from the corner grocery flagged her down. A stout Polish woman with flour permanently dusted on her apron. Mrs. Kowalski grabbed her elbow and called her sweetheart, then asked if she didn't know what had happened. Her Uncle Harlan had passed away 10 days earlier. The funeral was already done. The sidewalk seemed to tilt beneath Vera's feet. She stood there with her valise in hand, unable to form words. Uncle Harlan had been healthy when she left. She'd called him from Detroit in her first week there. He'd said everything was fine, told her about listening to the Pirates game on the radio, said he was looking forward to her coming home. Vera finally managed to ask how he had died. Mrs. Kowalski explained that it had been a heart attack, according to what people were saying. They found him in the morning in his apartment. His nephew had handled everything, buried him proper at Homewood Cemetery. Vera felt ice crystallize in her stomach as she asked, "What nephew?" Uncle Harlan didn't have any other nephews. In fact, he didn't have any nephews at all. She was his niece. Mrs. Kowalski's face creased with confusion. She explained that there had been a young man, maybe 35 years old. He'd said his name was Emmett, that he'd come from some farm town down south. Vera's uncle had told Mrs. Kowalski himself that it was his brother's boy, come up from Tennessee to help him out. The man was living in the apartment now. He had all the papers, claimed that Vera's uncle had left him the place in his will. Vera dropped her valise right there on the sidewalk and ran the 6 blocks to the Lawrenceville apartment. The October air burned in her lungs. She took the stairs 2 at a time to the 2nd floor and pounded on Uncle Harlan's door. For a long moment, nothing. Then she heard footsteps inside, and the door opened a crack, chain still engaged. Through the gap, a lean face appeared. A man around 35 with sharp features, watery blue eyes, and a thin mouth that looked like it had never smiled genuinely in its life. The man asked flatly if he could help her. The voice was unwelcoming. Vera identified herself as Vera Caldwell, Harlan Caldwell's niece. She demanded that he open the door immediately. The man studied her for a long moment, then unhooked the chain. Vera pushed inside and stopped cold in the entryway. The apartment looked the same but felt completely foreign. The photographs that had always stood on the hall table were gone. The brass spittoon Uncle Harlan had inherited from his father was missing. Instead of her uncle's old wool peacoat on the rack, there hung a stained canvas work jacket she'd never seen before. Vera's voice shook as she asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Emmett Prather. He claimed to be Harlan Caldwell's nephew by way of his brother Calvin. He recited the story like he'd rehearsed it. He'd come up from Crossville, Tennessee about 6 weeks back. Uncle Harlan had asked him to come help him. The old man had wanted family around in his old age. He'd left Emmett the apartment, all legal and proper. Vera's hands balled into fists as she declared it a lie. Harlan Caldwell had indeed had a brother named Calvin, but Calvin had died in the Great War, 1918, in France. He'd never married, never had children. Emmett walked calmly into the main room and returned with a manila folder. He handed it to Vera with an expression of practiced patience, then proceeded to show her the documents. There was the will, notarized and witnessed. There was his birth certificate showing Emmett Calvin Prather, born March 27, 1909, in Crossville, Cumberland County, Tennessee. The mother's name was listed as Ida Mae Prather. The father's name, Calvin Joseph Caldwell. There was also the death certificate for Calvin Caldwell, showing he died of influenza in October 1918 in Chattanooga. And there was the probate court order recognizing Emmett as sole heir. He insisted everything was in order. Vera's hands trembled as she leafed through the documents. Stamps, signatures, official seals. It all looked legitimate. The will was dated September 25th, right when she'd been in Detroit for training. She demanded to know where they had buried Uncle Harlan and why she hadn't been notified. Emmett explained that they'd tried to find her. The landlady at her building had said she was out of town for work. They'd had to move quickly. War rationing meant they couldn't keep the body at the funeral home long. They needed the space. He lit a lucky strike without offering her one, then told her Uncle Harlan was at Homewood Cemetery, Section F, Lot 247. He'd gotten a nice stone, paid for it himself. Vera stumbled out of the apartment, unable to breathe in that space another second. She walked blindly through Lawrenceville's narrow streets until she found herself on a bench near the old brewery, shaking. All night she sat in her own studio apartment in the Strip District, trying to make sense of what had happened. At dawn, she took the streetcar out to Homewood Cemetery. The grave was fresh, the earth still dark and loose. A simple granite marker read, Harlan Joseph Caldwell, 1876 to 1944, beloved uncle. Vera collapsed onto her knees and wept. She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't been there when they lowered him into the ground. And something about all this was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. She knew the family history. Calvin Caldwell had indeed gone to France with the 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard. He'd survived the trenches only to die in the influenza pandemic that swept through the demobilization camps. Uncle Harlan had grieved his younger brother terribly, but he'd always been clear. Calvin died unmarried at 22, with no children. Vera had heard the story dozens of times when she was growing up, asking why she had so few relatives. So Emmett Prather was a fraud. But how had he gotten documentation that looked so real? And most importantly, what had really happened to Uncle Harlan? Hook 1. Healthy hearts don't stop for no reason. The next day, Vera went to the law office of Weinstein and Associates on Smithfield Street, where the will had been executed. The attorney, a middle-aged man named Bernard Weinstein with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades navigating other people's disasters, received her in his wood-paneled office. Weinstein reviewed the file and assured her the will had been properly executed. Mr. Harlan Caldwell had come in on September 25th, he explained, of sound mind and clear intent. He'd expressed his wish to leave his apartment and personal effects to his nephew, Emmett Calvin Prather. Weinstein had witnessed the signature himself. Vera leaned forward and asked if he'd verified the relationship. The attorney explained that Mr. Prather had provided all the necessary documentation: a birth certificate showing Calvin Caldwell as father, a death certificate for Calvin Caldwell, and an affidavit from the Cumberland County Courthouse confirming the family connection. He wasn't empowered to question the authenticity of state-issued documents. Vera protested that she was Uncle Harlan's actual niece, his brother's daughter. Why wouldn't Uncle Harlan have mentioned her? Weinstein removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. He explained that a testator was free to dispose of property as he saw fit. Mr. Caldwell had explained that Vera was established with her own residence and employment, while Mr. Prather had come all the way from Tennessee to provide companionship and assistance. The old man had felt grateful. It wasn't uncommon. Vera left the office feeling like she'd walked into a wall. But she wasn't ready to give up. That evening, she returned to the Lawrenceville building and knocked on the door of Mrs. Angeline Russo, who lived across the hall from Uncle Harlan's apartment. When the old woman let her in, Vera asked her to tell everything she knew about this Emmett character. When he'd shown up, how he'd acted with Uncle Harlan. Everything. Mrs. Russo made coffee on her gas range and sat heavily at her kitchen table. She explained that Emmett had come around late August, early September maybe. Vera's uncle had told her about the nephew from down south who was going to help out around the place. Mrs. Russo had been surprised because Harlan had never mentioned family in Tennessee before, but she'd figured that people lose touch. Maybe they'd reconnected. Emmett had seemed quiet enough. He'd done the shopping, carried the coal bucket up from the cellar. Vera's uncle had seemed happy to have him around. Vera asked when Uncle Harlan had died. Mrs. Russo recalled it was October 5th, in the morning. Emmett had come running down to Mr. DiNardo's apartment. He had the only telephone on their floor, hollering to call an ambulance. But by the time they'd gotten there, nothing could be done. The doctor had said it was a massive coronary, that Uncle Harlan had probably died in his sleep. Emmett had taken it hard, crying and carrying on. He'd organized the funeral himself, paid for everything. People had said he was a good nephew, that not everyone would do that for an old man. Vera gripped her coffee cup until her knuckles went white. The picture forming was horrifying. This Emmett had appeared from nowhere, wormed his way into a lonely old man's trust, gotten him to change his will, and 10 days after the will was signed, Uncle Harlan had died of a heart attack. Too convenient. Vera asked if it hadn't seemed strange to Mrs. Russo that Uncle Harlan had died so suddenly. He'd always been healthy. The old woman's face clouded. She admitted that now that Vera mentioned it, there had been something odd. She'd run into Uncle Harlan on the stairs a couple days before he died, maybe October 2nd or 3rd. She'd asked how he was feeling. He'd said his stomach had been giving him trouble, probably something he'd eaten didn't agree with him. She'd told him to try some baking soda, but then later she'd thought, maybe it was his heart already. They said that before a heart attack, sometimes you got stomach pains. Vera set down her cup and asked if Mrs. Russo had ever seen what Uncle Harlan was eating those last few days. The neighbor admitted she hadn't really seen much. Emmett had been doing all the cooking by then. He'd said he wanted to give Vera's uncle a rest. A cold dread settled over Vera. She'd read about it in the crime magazines she sometimes bought at the newsstand. Poisoning disguised as natural death. Especially with old people, who might die of any number of causes. A little arsenic, a little rat poison, and suddenly a healthy man was dead of stomach trouble. But how could she prove it now, with Uncle Harlan already buried for 10 days? Hook 2. Dead men tell tales, if you dig deep enough. Vera spent the next week working at the steel mill during the day and researching at the Carnegie Library in the evenings. The library stayed open late during wartime, accommodating the shifts of factory workers who wanted to use the reading rooms. Vera became a familiar sight to the night librarian, Miss Eleanor Pritchard, a spinster in her 60s who helped Vera navigate the microfilm machines and newspaper archives. She pulled old newspapers on microfilm, looking for similar cases. What she found chilled her. Dozens of stories about elderly people dying under mysterious circumstances, their property immediately claimed by previously unknown relatives. The pattern was disturbingly consistent across cities and years. In Newark in 1938, a retired school teacher named Abigail Morton had died suddenly at age 71, leaving her home to a nephew who'd appeared 6 weeks earlier. In Indianapolis in 1940, a former railroad conductor named Chester Woolridge, 73, had died of heart failure, and his savings had gone to a cousin from rural Indiana. In Columbus in 1941, an elderly seamstress named Harriet Fenn had died after a brief illness, her property claimed by a grandnephew nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen before. One case particularly stood out. A widow in Philadelphia named Constance Whitmore, who died in 1941 at age 69, leaving her 3-story row house on Spruce Street to a supposed cousin named Ernest Palmer. Palmer had appeared in late summer of that year, claiming to be the son of Mrs. Whitmore's deceased cousin from western Pennsylvania. He'd stayed with her for 5 weeks, helping with household chores and shopping. Mrs. Whitmore had changed her will in his favor on September 3rd. She died on September 29th of what the doctor had called gastric distress leading to cardiac arrest. The Philadelphia Inquirer had run a follow-up story 3 months later. The cousin had turned out to be an imposter who'd obtained fake documents in rural Virginia. He'd sold the row house for $4,200 in cash and disappeared before Mrs. Whitmore's actual family members, a niece in Boston and a nephew in Baltimore, could contest the will. By the time the fraud was discovered, Ernest Palmer was gone without a trace. Vera copied down every detail she could find, filling a notebook with dates, names, locations, and circumstances. She noticed that many of the cases involved elderly people living alone in cities, that the supposed relatives always came from rural areas with poor record-keeping, that the time between the will being changed and the victim's death was usually between 1 and 4 weeks, and that stomach problems were frequently mentioned before death. Vera realized she was dealing with something bigger than one opportunistic criminal. This was a pattern, a system, and if Emmett Prather was part of it, he'd done this before. She took a day off work and went to the Office of Vital Statistics at the county courthouse. She requested copies of Calvin Caldwell's death certificate and any birth records for children born to Calvin Caldwell in Tennessee between 1900 and 1920. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Dorothy, returned after 20 minutes with a single document. She explained that they only had a death certificate for Calvin Joseph Caldwell, showing he died in October 1918 in Chattanooga. There were no birth records in Pennsylvania for any children. Tennessee would have those records, if they existed. Vera asked if Dorothy could check whether anyone else had requested these records recently. The clerk consulted a logbook and confirmed that someone had requested Calvin Caldwell's death certificate back in August. She squinted at the signature in the ledger. It had been signed out by E. Prather, so Emmett had been there, getting the documentation he'd need to establish his fake identity. Vera's next stop was the Pittsburgh Police Department's Detective Bureau, a grim stone building on Forbes Avenue that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. The detective who took her statement was a heavy-set man in his 50s named Frank Kowalski, no relation to the grocer, he assured her. He listened to her story with a skeptical expression, making notes in a spiral pad. Detective Kowalski told her he understood she was upset about her uncle's death, but what she was describing wasn't necessarily a crime. People made wills all the time, leaving property to whoever they wanted. Even if this Emmett fellow wasn't who he claimed to be, if her uncle had willingly signed that will. Vera interrupted and asked what if Uncle Harlan had been poisoned. Kowalski's pen stopped moving. He acknowledged that was a serious accusation and asked if she had any evidence. Vera laid out her case. Uncle Harlan had been healthy. He'd suddenly developed stomach problems right before he died. This stranger had appeared out of nowhere, gotten him to change his will, and 10 days later he was dead. Didn't the detective find that suspicious? Kowalski admitted that suspicious wasn't the same as evidence. He asked if there had been an autopsy. Vera said she didn't know and asked how she could find out. The detective made a note and said he'd check with the coroner's office, but he had to tell her that if the doctor who'd pronounced Uncle Harlan dead had signed off on natural causes, there probably hadn't been an autopsy. During wartime, with staff shortages, they didn't perform autopsies unless there were obvious signs of foul play. Vera asked if they could exhume the body and do an autopsy now. The detective shook his head. That would require a court order, and a judge wouldn't grant it without probable cause. Right now, all she had was suspicion. She needed to bring him something concrete. Vera left the police station frustrated but not defeated. She needed evidence, something tangible that would prove Emmett Prather was a fraud and possibly a murderer. Her next move was to send a telegram to the Cumberland County Courthouse in Crossville, Tennessee. She requested verification of the birth record for Emmett Calvin Prather, son of Calvin Caldwell and Ida Mae Prather, born March 1909. The response came back a week later. The clerk's reply was brief and devastating. No birth record had been found matching that description. The courthouse records for 1909 were incomplete due to fire damage in 1923. They were unable to confirm or deny the existence of such a record. So that's how he'd done it. He'd chosen a county where records were incomplete, where it would be impossible to definitively prove he didn't exist. It was cunning, methodical. This wasn't some impulsive crime. This was carefully planned. Hook 3. The Forger's Trail. Vera decided to go to Tennessee herself. She took a week's leave from the steel mill, scraped together money for a train ticket, and boarded the Pennsylvania Railroad headed south on a cold November morning. The steel mill supervisor, A gruff man named Walter Meacham, who'd lost a son at Normandy, was surprisingly understanding when she explained she needed time to investigate her uncle's death. He told her to take what she needed, that family came first. Her station would be waiting when she got back. The journey took 20 hours, with changes in Washington and Bristol. The train was crowded with servicemen heading to new assignments, war workers traveling between defense plants, and civilians navigating the wartime transportation system. Vera sat in a coach car, watching the industrial landscapes of Pennsylvania give way to the rolling hills of Maryland and Virginia, then the mountains of East Tennessee. She arrived in Crossville exhausted, checking into a modest boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Howell, who eyed Vera's factory clothes and Pittsburgh accent with curiosity. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, built around the courthouse square. Most of the storefronts had faded "Buy War Bonds" posters in their windows. Several buildings showed signs of the Depression-era poverty that had hit rural Tennessee harder than the cities. As Mrs. Howell showed Vera to a simple room on the second floor, she remarked that Vera was a long way from home and asked what brought her to Cumberland County. Vera replied that she was doing family research, which was technically true. Mrs. Howell nodded knowingly. She said a lot of folks had lost track of kinfolk during the hard times. The Depression had scattered families something fierce. She asked if Vera was looking for someone in particular. Vera explained she was looking for a woman who used to live there, named Ida Mae Prather. She would have been there around 1909, maybe into the 20s. The landlady's face showed no recognition. She said it was before her time, but that old Silas Hutchins at the courthouse might know. His family had been there since before the war between the states. The courthouse was a stolid brick building on Main Street, built in the 1890s, with aspirations of grandeur that the county's economy had never quite fulfilled. Inside, the floors were worn linoleum and the walls needed paint. The county clerk, an elderly man named Silas Hutchins with liver-spotted hands and a shock of white hair, greeted her with Southern courtesy but said he couldn't help much. He explained that the fire of 1923 had destroyed most of their birth records from 1908 to 1915. Lightning had struck the old courthouse annex where they'd kept the archives. They'd lost decades of documents. He shook his head sadly. They had some reconstructions based on family Bibles and church records that people had brought in after the fire, but they were incomplete. If she was looking for someone born in that period, it was hit or miss. Vera asked if there was any record of a woman named Ida Mae Prather living there around 1909. Hutchins disappeared into the archives for nearly half an hour. Vera could hear him moving boxes, the rustle of old paper, occasional muttered curses. He returned, dust-covered, carrying a ledger that looked like it might crumble to pieces. He'd found a property tax record for an Ida Prather, widow, who'd owned a small farm on the Cumberland Plateau until 1920. 40 acres, mostly timber. She'd paid her taxes regularly until that year. Then the property had been sold at auction for back taxes. After that, there were no records. She'd most likely moved away. Vera asked if the woman had had children. Hutchins explained that property tax records didn't list dependents, but if she'd had children, they would have been noted on the census. He pulled out another volume, labeled 1920, Federal Census, Cumberland County. He flipped through pages, squinting at the handwritten entries. He found the entry, Ida Prather, widow, age 41, occupation listed as seamstress, living alone, no children listed. Vera felt a grim satisfaction. Another piece of evidence that Emmett's story was fabricated. She thanked Hutchins and walked out into the thin November sunlight. The town felt frozen in time, untouched by the war that was transforming the rest of the country. A few old men sat on benches outside the courthouse, chewing tobacco and talking in slow mountain drawls. Vera spent 2 more days in Crossville, systematically tracking down anyone who might remember Ida Prather. She visited the Baptist church, where the current minister, Reverend Amos Blackwell, showed her the membership records. Ida Prather had been a member from 1915 to 1920, attending regularly but keeping to herself. The minister's predecessor, long dead, had noted in the margins that she was a widow, reserved, with no family. At the general store, an ancient establishment that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, Vera talked to the proprietor's father, a man in his 80s named Ezekiel Tucker. He remembered Ida Prather vaguely. He recalled she'd been a quiet woman. Her husband had died in a mining accident before Tucker was old enough to remember. She'd taken in sewing, made wedding dresses and such. Barely scraped by. He remembered his mother saying it was a shame, a woman alone like that, with no children to help her. He spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon and added that she'd left town around 1920, after the farm got taken for taxes. He'd heard she went to Chattanooga or maybe Nashville. Never heard anything after that. One man, a farmer named Zebulon Meeks, who claimed to be 90 years old, remembered Ida Prather more clearly. Sitting on the porch of a weathered farmhouse 5 miles outside town, he called her a strange woman. She'd kept to herself mostly. Her husband had died young, mining accident, he thought, over at the coal works near Grassy Cove. This would have been around 1905, 1906 maybe. She'd worked as a seamstress, barely scraped by. No children that he'd ever heard about, and in a town that small, you heard about children. Every birth, every baptism, everybody knew. If Ida Prather had had a child, they would have known. He spat tobacco juice and added that she'd left in 1920, moved to Chattanooga or Nashville, somebody had said. Never heard of her again. Vera asked if anyone named Caldwell had ever lived in Cumberland County. Meeks shook his head and said not that he could recall. And he'd been there his whole life. She returned to Pittsburgh with her suspicions confirmed, but her evidence still circumstantial. Emmett Prather had constructed an identity using the fragments of real people's lives, filling in the gaps with fabrications that couldn't be easily disproven. He'd chosen Ida Prather precisely because she'd been a solitary widow with no children, knowing there would be no relatives to contradict his story. And he'd exploited the courthouse fire of 1923 to claim that his birth records had been destroyed, making it impossible to definitively prove he didn't exist. Back at the police station, Detective Kowalski reviewed her findings with a grim expression. He acknowledged it was good work, but said it still wasn't enough for an exhumation or criminal charges. They needed to prove Emmett Prather wasn't who he said he was, and they needed to prove her uncle had been murdered. Right now, they had holes in Tennessee records, and her word that the old man didn't have a nephew. Vera suddenly asked, what if they could prove Emmett had done this before? What if he'd run this scam on other people? Kowalski's eyebrows rose. He asked if she had reason to think that. Vera explained it was too sophisticated for a first-time criminal. The fake documents, knowing which courthouse to use, the timing, everything suggested he was practiced. The detective leaned back in his chair. He said, all right, he'd give her a few weeks. He'd put out inquiries to other police departments, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit. If this character had worked this scheme before, maybe somebody had a file on him. Hook 4. The pattern emerges. 6 weeks later, in early January 1945, Detective Kowalski called Vera at the steel mill. He told her without preamble that she'd been right. She needed to come down to the station to see what they'd found. When Vera arrived, Kowalski's desk was covered with files and telegrams. He gestured for her to sit. He explained they'd gotten responses from 7 cities. 4 of them had cases matching her description. In Baltimore in 1939, an elderly woman had died suddenly, and her property had gone to a supposed nephew from West Virginia named Emmett Pritchard. In Cleveland in 1941, a widower had died of heart failure, leaving his house to a cousin from Kentucky named Emmett Pruitt. In Detroit in 1942, an elderly man had died, and his apartment had gone to a great-nephew from rural Michigan named Earl Pritchard. In Philadelphia in 1943, a widow had died, and her row house had gone to a distant relative named Emmett Parker. Vera breathed the question. Was it the same man? Kowalski said probably. Witnesses described a thin man in his mid-30s, quiet and polite, always from a rural area where records were poor, always showing up a few weeks before the victim died, always inheriting everything. And then he would disappear, Sell the property quickly and move on. Vera asked in horror how many people he had killed. The detective said they could only confirm 4 deaths before her uncle, but there could be more. Most times, nobody suspected murder because the victims were old and death seemed natural. And if there were no relatives to contest the will, the case closed clean. Vera asked if they could arrest Emmett now. Kowalski grimaced. Not yet, he explained. They had a pattern, but they needed solid proof he was the same person in all these cases. And they needed evidence of murder in at least one case. He'd already put in a request to the coroner's office for exhumation of her uncle's remains. A judge was reviewing it. 3 weeks later, the court order came through. On a freezing February morning, Vera stood at Homewood Cemetery while a work crew dug up Uncle Harlan's grave. She tried not to cry as they lifted the casket, simple pine, already showing moisture damage from the winter ground. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Samuel Abramson, the deputy coroner, a meticulous man who'd worked on poisoning cases before. Vera waited in a courthouse hallway for 6 hours while he worked. When he finally emerged, his expression was carefully neutral. He suggested they talk in his office. Once the door was closed, Dr. Abramson pulled out a sheaf of papers. He explained that the deceased had shown signs consistent with arsenic poisoning. Tissue samples from the liver and kidneys showed elevated arsenic levels, approximately 15 times normal background levels. The pattern suggested chronic exposure over several days to weeks, consistent with repeated small doses. Vera's hands shook as she stated that Emmett had poisoned Uncle Harlan. The doctor confirmed the levels were consistent with poisoning. Arsenic caused gastrointestinal distress initially, which matched the stomach complaints she'd mentioned. In an elderly person, especially one with any underlying heart weakness, the stress on the cardiovascular system could trigger a fatal coronary event. So, technically, the cause of death had been heart failure, but it had been induced by poisoning. Kowalski asked if this was enough to arrest Emmett Prather. Dr. Abramson said it was enough to establish homicide. Whether they could prove Prather had administered the poison was the detective's job. Hook 5. The Trap. With evidence of murder, Detective Kowalski obtained a warrant to search Uncle Harlan's apartment. They arrived early on a March morning with 4 uniformed officers. Emmett answered the door in his undershirt, his eyes widening when he saw the police. Kowalski announced that Emmett Prather was under arrest for the murder of Harlan Caldwell, then pulled out handcuffs. Emmett protested that it was insane. Uncle Harlan had died of a heart attack. The doctor had said so. The detective informed him that the autopsy showed arsenic poisoning, and they'd connected him to at least 4 similar deaths in other cities. He was done. As the officers led Emmett away, Vera and Kowalski searched the apartment. In a steamer trunk under the bed, they found a collection of identity documents, birth certificates, letters, affidavits, all for different names, all from rural counties across the South and Midwest. There were also bottles of patent medicines and a small tin labeled rat poison, Paris green, which contained arsenic trioxide. At the police station, Emmett refused to talk until a public defender arrived. But Vera wasn't done. She went back to the apartment alone that afternoon and searched more carefully. In the back of the closet, hidden under loose floorboards, she found a wooden box. Inside were newspaper clippings, obituaries, dozens of them, from cities across the country, dating back to 1935. Each one was circled in pencil, elderly people who died alone, leaving property to distant relatives. Also in the box was a ledger, meticulously kept, showing addresses, dates, and sums of money, the proceeds from selling inherited properties. Vera brought the box to Detective Kowalski. He spread the contents across his desk, his face darkening as he read. He swore and said this man had been doing this for a decade. Louisville in 1935, Memphis in 1937, Richmond in 1938. He'd been moving city to city, hunting victims, killing them, stealing their homes. Vera's uncle had been at least number 14, maybe more. The trial began in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. On May 8th, As bells rang across Pittsburgh celebrating VE Day, the jury was being selected for Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Emmett Prather. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Margaret Flynn, one of the few women in the prosecutor's office, a sharp-minded graduate of Duquesne Law School who'd fought her way into a profession that didn't welcome women. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a sensation in Pittsburgh newspapers. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators, many of them elderly people who'd read about the case and felt a personal stake in seeing justice done. Flynn presented the arsenic evidence first, calling Dr. Abramson to the stand to explain in clinical detail what he'd found in Uncle Harlan's exhumed remains. She showed the jury photographs of the tissue samples, explained how arsenic accumulated in the body, described the progression of symptoms from gastrointestinal distress to cardiovascular collapse. Then, she presented the false identity documents. She called the clerk from Cumberland County Courthouse who testified via affidavit that no birth record existed for Emmett Calvin Prather. She called the Baptist minister from Crossville, who confirmed that Ida Prather had had no children. She called Ezekiel Tucker and Zebulon Meeks, both of whom had made the long train journey to Pittsburgh to testify that Ida Prather had lived and died alone. Flynn introduced the ledger found in Emmett's apartment, showing it to the jury page by page. Each entry represented a life ended, a home stolen, a family destroyed. She traced the pattern of names: Emmett Pritchard, Emmett Pruitt, Earl Pritchard, Emmett Parker, Emmett Prather. All slight variations, all from rural areas, all appearing shortly before an elderly person died. She called witnesses from the other cities. From Baltimore came the neighbor of Ruth Zimmerman's aunt, who described how an Emmett Pritchard had appeared in 1939, helped the elderly woman for a few weeks, inherited her house, and vanished. From Cleveland came a former police detective who'd investigated the 1941 death of a widower who'd left everything to a mysterious cousin from Kentucky. From Detroit came medical records showing that an elderly man who died in 1942 had complained of stomach pains before his death, the same symptoms Uncle Harlan had exhibited. Flynn painted a picture of a predator who'd refined his technique over a decade, learning from each killing, perfecting the documents, choosing victims more carefully. She described how Emmett would read obituaries in distant cities, looking for elderly people who died with surviving relatives. He'd note which obituaries mentioned the deceased was from a rural area, because that's where he could fabricate connections to real people. He'd travel to that area, research old records, find a widow or unmarried woman who died or moved away decades ago, and create a fake identity as her child. The defense attorney, Roland Hughes, a weary public defender who knew his case was hopeless but did his best, tried to argue that the deaths were coincidental, that Emmett was simply an unfortunate man who happened to be present when elderly relatives died of natural causes. But Flynn systematically dismantled every argument. When Hughes suggested that the arsenic might have come from rat poison that Uncle Harlan himself had used, Flynn produced Mrs. Russo's testimony that Uncle Harlan had never had rats in his apartment and never kept poison. When Hughes argued that the false documents might be explained by record-keeping errors rather than fraud, Flynn showed that the pattern was too consistent across too many jurisdictions to be accidental. The turning point came when Mrs. Russo took the stand. She was a sympathetic witness, a grandmother herself, a widow who'd known Uncle Harlan for 20 years, who could barely contain her tears as she described his final days. She testified tearfully that he'd been a healthy man. Maybe he'd moved slower than he used to. Maybe he'd gotten tired easier. But he'd been sharp. He'd still read the newspaper every day, listened to the radio, done his own shopping until that man had shown up. Flynn asked her to describe Uncle Harlan's final weeks. Mrs. Russo explained that it had changed after Mr. Prather arrived. Harlan had gotten quieter. He'd stopped coming to the Monday evening card game in Mr. DiNardo's apartment. They'd been playing pinochle together for years. When she'd asked him why, he'd said Emmett thought it was too much excitement for him, that he should rest more. Then Emmett had started doing all the shopping, all the cooking. He'd said he was helping, but it had felt like he was taking over. Flynn asked if she'd seen Mr. Caldwell in his final days. Mrs. Russo dabbed her eyes and said she'd tried. On October 3rd, 2 days before he died, she'd heard Harlan coughing through the wall. Bad coughing, like he was sick. She'd gone to check on him, knocked on the door. Emmett had answered. He'd said Harlan was sleeping, didn't want to be disturbed, that he'd been feeling poorly, but it was just a stomach bug. She'd offered to bring soup. Emmett had said no, he had it handled. She said she should have insisted. If she'd seen Harlan, if she'd called a doctor. She broke down completely. Flynn let the moment hang in the courtroom. Then she asked quietly whether, in the 20 years Mrs. Russo had known Harlan Caldwell, he'd ever had stomach bugs. The neighbor said never. He'd had a constitution like iron. Flynn pressed, and after Mr. Prather started cooking his meals, that's when the stomach problems began? Mrs. Russo confirmed it was true. Flynn said she had no further questions. Hughes tried to rehabilitate on cross-examination, suggesting that elderly people often developed health problems suddenly, but Mrs. Russo wouldn't budge. She knew what she'd seen. Flynn called other neighbors who testified to the same pattern. Uncle Harlan had been healthy and independent until Emmett arrived, then had become progressively weaker and more isolated, always with Emmett controlling access to him. The final piece of evidence was the tin of rat poison found in Emmett's steamer trunk. A chemist from the Allegheny County Laboratory testified that the poison was Paris green, a compound containing arsenic trioxide, and that the chemical signature matched the arsenic found in Uncle Harlan's remains. Hughes called no witnesses for the defense. Emmett himself did not take the stand, which Flynn made sure to mention in her closing argument. She told the jury that the defendant sat silently because he had no explanation that wouldn't condemn him. He couldn't explain why he had rat poison when the apartment had no rats. He couldn't explain why his birth certificate came from a county where records were conveniently destroyed. He couldn't explain why the mother listed on that certificate had had no children. He couldn't explain why Uncle Harlan Caldwell had suddenly developed fatal stomach problems just days after changing his will. He couldn't explain the ledger documenting a decade of similar deaths and inheritances. The evidence spoke for itself. On June 12, 1945, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Cornelius Blackburn, a stern old man who'd been on the bench since before the Great Depression, who'd seen every kind of crime humanity could devise, sentenced Emmett Prather to death by electrocution. The judge declared that the defendant was a predator. He'd hunted the vulnerable, the lonely, the trusting. He'd violated the bonds of family and human decency for money. He'd turned the natural kindness of elderly people into a weapon against them. He'd destroyed at least 14 lives that they knew of, and possibly many more. The law allowed the judge no mercy for such crimes, and his conscience demanded none. Emmett would be taken from this place to Rockview Penitentiary, and there he would be executed by electrocution. The judge concluded by hoping that God would have mercy on his soul, though he'd shown none to his victims. Emmett showed no emotion as they led him away. His face remained blank, his eyes empty. Vera, watching from the gallery, thought he looked like a man who'd never felt anything real in his entire life. Hook 6. One woman changes the system. Vera thought justice had been served. Emmett Prather would die for his crimes, and Uncle Harlan would be avenged. But 2 months after the trial, in August 1945, just as the war with Japan ended and the country erupted in celebration, she received a letter that changed everything. The letter came from a woman in Baltimore named Ruth Zimmerman. Ruth had read about the trial in the Baltimore Sun, which had picked up the story from the wire services. She recognized the pattern immediately. It matched exactly what had happened to her aunt, Constance Whitmore, in 1941. Ruth wrote in careful, educated handwriting that she'd always suspected something was wrong. Her aunt had been a healthy woman, sharp as a tack at 69. Then this supposed cousin had appeared from nowhere, and within 2 months she was dead. Ruth had tried to contest the will, hired a lawyer, but the documents had all seemed legitimate. The lawyer had said that without proof of fraud, they had no case. By the time Ruth could raise questions, the man had sold the house and vanished. The police had said it wasn't their concern, civil matter, inheritance dispute, not a crime. Ruth had spent years wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing, if she was just a bitter relative who couldn't accept her aunt's choice. But reading about Vera's uncle, about this Emmett Prather and his methods, she finally understood what had really happened. She thanked Vera for having the courage to pursue justice. Vera had given Ruth's family answers they'd thought they'd never get, and she'd probably saved dozens of other families from the same fate. More letters followed over the next weeks. From Cleveland came a letter from the daughter of the widower who died in 1941, explaining how she'd been estranged from her father and had arrived for the funeral only to find a stranger had inherited everything. From Detroit came a nephew who'd been overseas with the Army when his uncle died in 1942, returning to find the apartment sold and no trace of the mysterious great-nephew who'd claimed it. From Richmond, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Columbus, Newark, families who'd lost elderly relatives under suspicious circumstances, who'd felt helpless against the legal system, who were grateful someone had finally stopped the killer. Vera read every letter, sometimes through tears. She realized something profound. The system had failed these people. The police departments in different cities hadn't communicated with each other. What looked like an isolated inheritance dispute in Baltimore had no connection to a similar case in Cleveland. The courts accepted documents at face value because clerks and judges had no way to verify identities across state lines. Nobody protected vulnerable elderly people from sophisticated predators who understood how to exploit the gaps in the system. She decided to do something about it. Using a small inheritance from Uncle Harlan's life insurance policy, ironically, Emmett hadn't known about it, hadn't thought to check if there were assets beyond the apartment. Vera rented a small office on the third floor of a building on Smithfield Street, in the heart of Pittsburgh's legal district. The rent was $35 a month, more than she could really afford, but the location was perfect. Across the street from the courthouse, walking distance from the law offices where elderly people might go to make wills. She hung a simple wooden sign outside the door. Elderly Protection Service, free consultations. She hired a secretary, a middle-aged widow named Phyllis Kowalczyk, who'd lost her own mother to a similar scam in 1938. Phyllis had been working as a typist at a law firm, but jumped at the chance to do something meaningful. During the interview, Phyllis explained that her mother had died alone. A man had shown up claiming to be a cousin from Poland, where her mother had been born. He'd had documents, spoke some Polish, knew enough about the family to seem legitimate. Phyllis's mother had changed her will, left him everything. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Heart attack, they'd said. By the time Phyllis and her brother could question it, the man was gone. If someone had helped them verify his identity, her mother might still be alive. The service started small. Vera placed advertisements in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Press. Approached by unknown relatives? Protect your assets. Free verification service for elderly Pittsburghers. The first client came in on a Thursday morning in October 1945. Her name was Mildred Thompson, 74 years old, a retired seamstress who lived alone in Bloomfield. A man claiming to be her late husband's nephew had shown up 2 weeks earlier, offering to help with housework and shopping. Mrs. Thompson explained nervously, twisting her handkerchief, that the man seemed nice enough. But her husband had never mentioned this nephew, and the man kept talking about how she should update her will, make sure her affairs were in order. It made her uncomfortable. Vera took down all the information. The supposed nephew's name, where he claimed to be from, what documents he'd shown. Then she got to work. She called the courthouse in the West Virginia county the man had mentioned, requesting verification of birth records. She contacted Mrs. Thompson's late husband's siblings, asking if they knew of a nephew by that name. She hired a private detective to follow the man and see where he really lived. Within a week, Vera had her answers. No birth record existed for the man in that county. The late husband's siblings had never heard of him. And the private detective discovered that the supposed Walter Thompson was actually living in a boarding house under the name Walter Kowalski and had been seen meeting with 2 other men who also seemed to be running similar schemes. Vera presented the evidence to Mrs. Thompson, who was horrified. Together, they went to the police. Detective Kowalski, who'd been promoted after the Prather case, arrested the man for attempted fraud. It turned out he was wanted in 3 other states for similar schemes. Mrs. Thompson hugged Vera with surprising strength and said she'd saved her life. She knew that man would have killed her. Word spread quickly after that. Within 6 months, Vera was handling 20 cases. Not all of them were scams. Sometimes the supposed relative was genuine, and Vera's service actually reunited families. But about 1 in 4 cases involved attempted fraud. She uncovered 3 more scam artists, none as prolific as Emmett Prather, but dangerous nonetheless. Working with Detective Kowalski, she helped build cases that led to 2 arrests and prevented numerous frauds. The service expanded. Vera brought in Marcus Washington, a retired police detective who'd worked fraud cases for 20 years and was happy to use his expertise for a good cause. She hired Evelyn Klein, a paralegal who'd been forced out of law school because of her gender, but who knew the law as well as any attorney. Together, they developed a systematic approach. Verify all family relationships through official records, conduct background checks on suspicious individuals, review proposed wills and property transfers for red flags, and educate elderly clients on how to protect themselves. They also compiled a registry of known scammers, sharing information with police departments across the state. When a new suspected case emerged, they could check if the person had worked under a different name in another city. In 1946, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a feature story about the service with the headline, "Woman Who Caught a Killer Now Protects the Elderly." The article described Vera's investigation of Emmett Prather, the trial, and her new mission. It included practical advice for elderly readers and their families, and it listed warning signs of inheritance fraud. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across Pennsylvania, from Erie, Harrisburg, Scranton, Reading, Allentown, asking for help or wanting to know how to start similar services in their cities. Vera responded to every letter, sharing her methods, offering guidance, sometimes even traveling to other cities to help investigate particularly complex cases. By 1948, similar organizations had sprung up in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Cleveland, all inspired by Vera's model. They shared information, creating an informal network that could track scammers who moved between cities. If a suspicious relative appeared in Philadelphia, the protection service there could check with Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Cleveland to see if anyone matching that description had worked scams elsewhere. The network proved remarkably effective. In one case, a man calling himself Edward Preston appeared in Philadelphia in 1947, claiming to be the nephew of an elderly woman. The Philadelphia service checked with Vera, who recognized the description and method of operation. It matched a man who'd attempted a scam in Pittsburgh 6 months earlier under the name Edgar Pritchard. The Philadelphia police arrested him before he could complete the fraud. In 1949, Pennsylvania State Representative Helen Morrison, a progressive Democrat from Philadelphia who'd been fighting for social welfare legislation throughout the 1940s, invited Vera to testify before a legislative committee considering reforms to inheritance law. Vera appeared in Harrisburg and presented data from her 4 years of casework. 127 attempted frauds investigated, 23 confirmed scams prevented, 8 arrests leading to convictions, millions of dollars in property protected, and 104 elderly Pennsylvanians saved from potential murder. She proposed specific reforms, each based on actual cases she'd handled. Mandatory verification of claimed familial relationships before probate courts would accept wills leaving property to distant relatives. A requirement that wills significantly changing prior bequests must be reviewed by independent counsel who would interview the testator separately from any beneficiaries. A state registry of vulnerable elderly people living alone, with regular social service check-ins funded by the state. Criminal penalties specifically for document forgery related to inheritance fraud, with enhanced sentencing when the fraud targeted elderly victims. And interstate information sharing among law enforcement agencies, with a centralized database of known inheritance fraud schemes. The committee was impressed. Representative Morrison became a champion of the legislation, working with Vera to refine the proposals and build support among her colleagues. In 1950, Pennsylvania passed the Elderly Protection Act, incorporating several of Vera's recommendations. It was groundbreaking legislation, the first of its kind in the nation, and it served as a model for other states. Vera continued her work through the 1950s and into the 1960s. She never married, dedicating herself entirely to the cause. There were occasional romantic interests: a widowed attorney who handled pro bono work for the service, a professor of social work at the University of Pittsburgh who shared her passion for protecting vulnerable populations. But none developed into lasting relationships. Her work consumed her, and she seemed content with that choice. The service grew steadily through the post-war years. By 1955, they'd handled over 800 cases and prevented an estimated 42 murders. The staff expanded to include 2 more investigators, a full-time attorney, and a social worker who specialized in working with elderly clients who'd been traumatized by scam attempts. Vera became a nationally recognized expert on elder fraud. She trained social workers, consulted with police departments from Boston to San Francisco, and personally investigated hundreds of cases. She developed a keen eye for the subtle patterns that distinguish genuine relatives from imposters. The slight hesitation when asked about family memories, the over-preparation that came from rehearsed stories rather than lived experience, the tendency to steer conversations toward financial matters. In 1958, she published her first article in the Journal of Social Work, titled "Inheritance Fraud as Systematic Predation: Recognizing and Preventing Financial Exploitation of the Elderly." It became required reading in social work programs across the country. The 1960s brought new challenges as the population aged and more elderly people lived alone. The post-war generation was more mobile than their parents had been, with children often living in different cities from their aging parents. This geographic separation created new vulnerabilities that scammers eagerly exploited. Vera adapted her methods, working with banks to flag suspicious large withdrawals or property transfers by elderly customers, partnering with physicians who treated elderly patients to watch for signs of financial exploitation, and collaborating with churches and community centers to create social networks that would notice when an elderly person suddenly became isolated. In 1963, she testified before a congressional subcommittee on aging, sharing her expertise with federal lawmakers. She sat in a hearing room in Washington, facing a panel of senators and representatives, and spoke for 2 hours about the systematic exploitation of elderly Americans. She presented case studies, carefully anonymized to protect privacy, showing how predators operated, how they chose victims, how they evaded detection. She told the committee that the schemes had evolved. In the 1940s, it had been forged birth certificates and fake wills. By the 1960s, it was high-pressure sales tactics, fraudulent investment schemes, and psychological manipulation. But the core remained the same: targeting isolated elderly people, gaining their trust, and stealing everything they had. Sometimes through outright theft, sometimes through murder disguised as natural death. Her testimony contributed to provisions in the Older Americans Act of 1965 that funded state protective services programs, adult protective services agencies, and legal assistance for elderly Americans. It was landmark federal legislation, and Vera's work had helped shape it. By 1970, when Vera was 51 years old, organizations based on her model operated in 43 states. The National Association for the Protection of the Elderly, which she'd helped found in 1962, had 200 member agencies serving elderly people across the country. Her work had become a recognized profession, a field of social work dedicated to preventing financial exploitation of seniors. Universities offered courses on elder protection, using Vera's methods and case studies as teaching materials. But the cost had been high. Vera had devoted her entire adult life to strangers, leaving little time for herself. She had few friends outside of colleagues. She'd never married, never had children. She lived modestly in the same studio apartment in the Strip District, spending her modest salary on the service rather than on herself. Her entire existence revolved around preventing others from experiencing the loss she'd endured when she was 25. She didn't regret her choices, but she sometimes wondered what life might have been like if she'd returned from Detroit to find Uncle Harlan alive, if Emmett Prather had never existed, if she'd married and had a family like other women her age. In early 1972, at age 53, Vera began experiencing persistent abdominal pain and unusual bleeding. She ignored it for months, too busy with casework to see a doctor. Finally, Phyllis, still her secretary after 27 years, insisted she get checked. The diagnosis was ovarian cancer, stage 3. It had already spread to her lymph nodes. The prognosis was poor. The disease had metastasized extensively. With surgery and the best available chemotherapy, the doctors gave her 2 years, perhaps 3. Without treatment, 6 months at most. Vera chose to fight. She underwent a radical hysterectomy at Allegheny General Hospital, followed by an aggressive chemotherapy regimen that left her weak and nauseated. She lost her hair, lost 40 pounds, but she kept working. Between chemotherapy sessions, she'd be at the office, reviewing cases, training staff, consulting on investigations. When Phyllis suggested she rest, Vera would insist she wasn't done yet. There were still people who needed help. She faced her mortality with the same methodical determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. She wrote detailed procedures for the Elderly Protection Service to continue without her, trained her successor, a young social worker named Valerie Morrison who reminded Vera of herself at 25 and ensured the organization would survive her death. And she wrote a book, working late into the night when the pain kept her awake anyway. She called it The Hunters: How I Fought the Predators Who Target Our Elderly. It was published in 1974, a comprehensive 400-page guide for families, social workers, and law enforcement. The book became a standard reference in social work schools and police academies. It detailed the psychology of inheritance fraudsters, the methods they used, and the systems needed to stop them. Vera Caldwell died on March 18, 1975, in a Pittsburgh hospital, at the age of 56. She was buried at Homewood Cemetery, not far from Uncle Harlan's grave. Her headstone reads, "She fought for those who could not fight for themselves." The Elderly Protection Service she founded still operates on Smithfield Street. In the 50 years since Emmett Prather's execution, the organization has helped over 5,000 elderly Pittsburghers avoid financial exploitation. That's her legacy, a living memorial to one woman's refusal to let injustice stand. Emmett Prather was electrocuted at Rockview Penitentiary on November 3, 1945. He never confessed, never showed remorse. But his crimes became a case study in criminal psychology, taught in universities, analyzed in textbooks. His methodical cruelty helped shape the protective systems that now exist. Vera couldn't bring Uncle Harlan back, but she ensured that thousands of others wouldn't suffer the same fate, wouldn't die alone and betrayed, their trust weaponized against them. Epilogue: Recognizing the Predator. More than 70 years have passed since those events, but the schemes Emmett Prather perfected are still alive. The details have changed: electronic documents instead of paper, identity theft instead of forged birth certificates, email scams instead of personal visits. But the essence remains: cynical predators hunting lonely, trusting elderly people. According to the National Adult Protective Services Association, financial exploitation of the elderly costs American families $36.5 billion annually. And that's only reported cases. Most victims never report, either because they're embarrassed, don't realize they've been scammed, or die before anyone discovers what happened. The warning signs Vera Caldwell identified in the 1940s remain relevant today. Sudden appearance of unknown relatives. If an elderly parent, grandparent, aunt, or uncle is suddenly visited by a supposed nephew, cousin, or old family friend nobody has ever heard of, that's a red flag. Real relatives don't materialize from nowhere. Rushed demands for will changes or power of attorney. If the new relative immediately starts talking about estate planning, updating wills, or getting power of attorney while grandma's still sharp, that's a scammer. Legitimate family members don't rush inheritance matters. Isolation from existing family and friends. Scammers work to isolate their victims. They convince the elderly person not to trust their children, not to see old friends, not to attend church or social activities. They create dependency, claiming to be the only one who really cares. Documents from obscure jurisdictions. If the relative presents birth certificates, marriage licenses, or other documents from small rural counties in distant states, especially places with poor record keeping, that's suspicious. That's where fake documents are easiest to create. Refusal of independent verification. If you suggest checking the relationship through genealogical research, contacting other family members, or reviewing official records, and the relative becomes defensive, angry, or hurt, asking if you don't trust them, that's a major warning sign. Unexplained health decline. If an elderly person who's been healthy suddenly develops mysterious stomach problems, weakness, confusion, or other symptoms after a new person enters their life, consider poisoning. Modern cases involve prescription drugs rather than arsenic, but the pattern is the same. What to do if you encounter a suspicious relative? Don't rush. No legal documents need to be signed immediately, no matter what the person claims. Take time to investigate. Verify everything. Request certified copies of birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other documents. Contact the issuing agencies directly to confirm authenticity. Use genealogy websites to check family trees. Consult professionals. Hire an attorney who specializes in elder law. Pay for a background check on the supposed relative. It's expensive, but losing a house worth $300,000 is more expensive. Inform other family members. Even if you're estranged from siblings, cousins, or adult children, contact them. Tell them about the situation. Get their input. Contact Adult Protective Services. Every state has an APS agency. They investigate suspected exploitation of vulnerable adults. Call them if you have concerns. Report to police. If you believe fraud or abuse is occurring, file a police report. Even if they don't investigate immediately, it creates a paper trail. Document everything. Keep notes of conversations, save emails and text messages, photograph any documents the suspicious person provides. If the case goes to court, you'll need evidence. The story of Vera Caldwell teaches us that vigilance is the only defense against predators. Uncle Harlan was intelligent, educated, and capable, but he was lonely and wanted to believe he had family. That very human vulnerability killed him. Emmett Prather paid for his crimes, but his successors are still out there, scrolling through obituaries, searching social media for isolated elderly people, refining the techniques he pioneered. If you're reading this and you have elderly parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or neighbors, call them today. Visit them. Don't leave them alone. Because loneliness is the vulnerability that predators exploit, and family connection is the best protection. Vera Caldwell lost Uncle Harlan but saved thousands. Her elderly protection service still operates at 445 Smithfield Street, Suite 300, Pittsburgh. Anyone can walk in, explain their situation, get help. It's free. It's confidential. It might save a life. Remember, a real relative doesn't appear suddenly demanding property transfers. A real relative is happy just to reconnect, to spend time together, to help without expectation of reward. Anyone who's in a hurry to get the house, the bank accounts, the assets, that's not family. That's a hunter. And their goal isn't your well-being, but your wealth. Stay alert. Protect yourself and your loved ones. And if something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Vera Caldwell did, and it exposed one of America's most prolific serial killers of the elderly. Her legacy is the reminder that ordinary people, armed with determination and refusing to accept injustice, can change systems that fail the vulnerable. One woman, grieving her uncle and seeking truth, built a movement that protects thousands. That's the real story, not just of Emmett Prather's evil, but of Vera Caldwell's courage. And it's a story we need to remember, because the predators haven't stopped hunting. They've just gotten better at hiding.